With the recent UN climate change report putting the focus firmly back into the climate change conference in Glasgow later on this year, Octopus Renewables Infrastructure Trust plays directly into the opportunities now into this particular sector. It had planned to raise £100 million recently, but in fact, because of the sheer uptake, it chose to go for £150 million to bring onto the balance sheet. Let's get an update now of what the business is doing with David Bird. He's an investment director of Octopus Renewables, which is the investment manager for the Octopus Renewables Infrastructure Trust. David, it's good to talk to you. Thanks indeed for coming on. I want to talk about some of the projects you're involved with and some of the recent developments in just a couple of minutes if I can. But I want to begin first of all by taking a further look at this money raising that you've undertaken. As I said, you were going for 100 million, but in fact the uptake was so big. Tell us a bit more about what's happened and your decision to take on more money.
Sure. Yeah. So as you say, we were looking to raise 100 million, and in fact we hit our maximum at 150. We were oversubscribed slightly at that level. So really pleasing for us and a vote of investor confidence in what we've done in the year and a half or so since we launched in late 2019. And the reason we were comfortable taking that extra capital from investors is that we see a really attractive pipeline ahead of us. So we've got a number of deals in exclusivity, some that we've transacted on recently, but there's plenty more to come. So the opportunity is there to put that capital to work and deliver some attractive return to investors as well as positive impact on the environment.
Yeah, and of course, before you raised the money, I think you had already obviously made the investment, and in fact, I think almost completed this new wind farm onshore in Sweden. Now, you've got a number of projects underway now. How much of an important point was this new wind farm in Sweden for the trust?
We were really pleased. So this wind farm in Sweden was the first investment we made with the IPO proceeds back in March of 2020. It was ready to build at that time, and construction is a really important part of Octopus Renewables Infrastructure Trust's mandate. It's one of the things that sets us apart from some of the other renewables investment trusts in the space. We have a real emphasis on construction. Octopus Renewables has a real strong track record in managing assets through the construction stage. What was particularly pleasing about this one is we've been able to deliver NAV growth to investors through successfully managing that construction process. And we've done all that through the COVID period. So the entire construction timeline happened throughout COVID, and we've managed to navigate our way around those many problems that have come out of COVID and successfully deliver a project on time and on budget. And having newly constructed projects is also a real benefit when you look at our impact metrics. So we're making a real difference by bringing new clean generation forward.
I mentioned that as a separate issue about the raising the money, because the money has come onto the balance sheet subsequent to all that work having been done, hasn't it, to the Swedish project. What are you going to do with the money now that's now come on into the company or the trust?
So we've got a number of potential investments ahead of us. We've also got a couple that have been announced since we've raised that money. But beyond those, we've got a pipeline that we talked to investors about when we were raising this capital arrangement across a number of countries in Europe. So there are still projects we have in exclusivity in Finland, for example. There are interesting pipeline projects in a number of other countries. So we hope to be deploying the remainder of that fundraise in the coming weeks and months.
How important is wind against other renewables such as solar? I ask this because I think you've just invested something like €7.5 million, I believe, in Simply Blue, which is a floating offshore wind development company, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So we look to have a balance of technologies in our portfolio. We think there's real benefits to investors. So we're very focused on having both solar and wind. What we thought was particularly interesting around Simply Blue, who are a really high quality developer who've been working in the space for a while now, is their focus, as you say, on floating offshore wind. And floating offshore wind is something that there isn't much of right now. But if we're going to be successful in decarbonising our economy and therefore building as much new wind generation as we need to over the coming decades, at some point the nearer bits of seabed are just going to run out, and we have to be able to go further afield and deeper. And so floating offshore wind's a technology that we think is going to experience huge growth in the coming decades, and this investment is one that's really well placed to capture those tailwinds.
What about solar then? How quickly do you want to get into solar? I believe that actually there has been a deal recently undertaken, hasn't there, for a portfolio of solar investment that's been undertaken by Octopus?
That's correct, yeah. So Octopus Renewables has been managing solar for well over a decade now. For Octopus Renewables Infrastructure Trust, we do have some solar already in the portfolio, and the most recent addition to that is a portfolio of 5 solar sites in Ireland, and these are ones that we have agreed to acquire once they're fully operational in the second half of next year. And that, again, is a really significant investment for us. The total investment amount's around £120 million, so a significant chunk of the capital that we've just raised that's earmarked against that investment, and one that we expect to deliver attractive yield for investors in due course.
What else is in the pipeline before we take a look at some of the rewards that investors can get out of this over the long term? What about the pipeline? Anything else you want to talk about specifically you think is of interest?
So diversification is key for us. So we've got a real mixture in our pipeline. We've got solar projects, we've got wind projects, and we've got a range of countries. So we invest across Europe and can invest into Australia as well. So we've got interesting projects coming through in Finland, potentially some in Poland, but beyond those in the nearer term, there's a range of projects in the UK and wider Europe that all look potentially attractive, and more details on those will come out as and when we transact. We can't give specifics until the deals are done, but there's certainly a lot out there that we think is interesting.
How important is government support to what you're doing? Clearly, as I said at the top, this UN climate report recently has really begun to stir up a lot of interest in this sector. We already knew that this sector was going to be in amongst the major headlines. We got this meeting, of course, in Glasgow, as I referred to at the end of the year, this big climate change conference. So clearly this is front and center of what we need to do. What is it you're doing as a trust to reward investors, to bring them on to look at this as an investment opportunity? Clearly, there's got to be a return. First of all, before we get into that, how important, as I said, is government support to this? Are you receiving subsidies? Do you get support? Do you get tax benefits? Do you get some sort of incentive to give you the opportunity to invest in these projects?
So we do, and because we invest across Europe, there is a range of different measures that we see. So most of the projects that have some kind of support comes by way of some sort of subsidy on the revenue they receive. So they're able effectively to sell their power either at a slightly higher price than a non-renewable generator might through some kind of special certificate, or in some cases actually it's not selling the power at any higher price, but it's got a government standing behind the price that it's going to receive. And that's what's really important for investors, is understanding what price the energy that these assets produce is going to be sold for. So that's a huge driver of value. But what we're seeing now actually is that the industry is starting to move away from, and indeed has moved quite some way from, having complete reliance on government support. So whilst government support certainly still has a role to play in order to get as much new generation built as we need, we have and we continue to make investments in projects that don't have government support, that are reliant just on market prices or on long-term agreements with large corporates. And again, as we move towards COP26 and beyond, we're seeing real appetite from corporates who need to decarbonize their own operations to enter into long-term agreements with generators such as ours to provide them with certainty of green power and us with certainty of pricing.
Just as a general comment on the business of renewables, we hear a lot about what's happening in Europe. We know that Boris Johnson has got some very ambitious targets here at home in the UK, of course, and Europe likewise. It's a lot going towards the Paris Climate Agreement and so forth. But sometimes we hear a little bit of a headwind and some more detailed debate about the advantages of all this from America. Do you get the feeling that America is still not totally on board with all this? We saw recently, of course, Joe Biden calling for OPEC to produce more oil to get the price of oil down. That's not going to help the cause of renewables, is it? If you've got cheaper oil, that's something else, I guess, that you're hoping for secretly, a higher oil price. So it steers more people into using renewables. Do you get the feeling that America still isn't totally wound into all this?
I think that the current US administration is probably more aligned behind renewables than the previous one. But no, not just with the US, with a number of countries, there is a tension, because I think although there's widespread recognition that renewables is the way of the future, there's less agreement amongst governments on how to make that transition, how to make sure people working in the oil and gas sector aren't disadvantaged, how to make sure that people who rely on oil and gas based energy to go about their daily lives aren't unfairly disadvantaged. And those aren't easy questions. But ultimately, our view is very strongly that we need to move as quickly as we can to a world that's a system that's dominated by renewables.
Yes, and of course, at Octopus, you are obviously building a future. I understand that, and that's exactly what we're seeing from renewables companies at the moment. They're obviously aiming for a time when people are more appreciative of what's been done. Investment returns. Talk to us a little bit about shareholders. What's the driver here? Why would I, if I had £1,000, want to invest it in Octopus Renewables? What am I going to get back?
Sure. So what we're aiming to give is a balance of sustainable yield, but also some longer term capital growth. So for this calendar year, we're targeting a 5 pence per share dividend, and our long term growth expectation is a 7 to 8% target for compound growth rate. So it's a mixture of income and capital growth, and one of the key differentiators, as I said, behind this particular infrastructure trust compared with some of the others, is we're looking to drive some of that capital growth through construction and through crystallizing gains as we successfully manage projects through construction, which is something that not all that many of the others out there do, certainly not to the extent that we do. And we think it makes it a more sustainable long-term proposition than something that's purely focused on income.
You mentioned a dividend price there. What's the yield? What are we getting back in terms of percentage on investments?
Yeah, ultimately that will depend on the share price. So at the moment, the share price and generally, in fact, the share price is traded at a healthy premium to net asset value. At the moment, it's in the low double digits. So 5 pence per share is going to work out as a yield somewhere in the 4% at the moment. But obviously, that will fluctuate depending on the underlying share price.
Okay, look, David, it's a pleasure. Thanks indeed for your time. It's great to be able to catch up with you, especially in the context of what's happening in terms of some of the headlines about renewables in the business. But David Bird, thanks for your time. That's David Bird, an investment director of Octopus Renewables, which is investment manager for the Octopus Renewables Infrastructure Trust. For more videos from us here at IGTV, join us on Twitter at IGCom, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.